This is an interesting video, guys, and I'm gonna preface this by saying that it's gonna be very information heavy. I normally don't do this. I always try to make them very dynamic, and it's going to be dynamic, of course, you know me. But I will be sharing a lot of things that might be, again, a little bit on the theory-heavy side of things. However, I guarantee that if you watch the whole video, your whole, idea as an artist will be changed. Some of you might have already heard this pieces of information that I'm going to show you, but I don't think you've heard this in the way I'm going to be explaining to you, because this is a method that I've been developing, and until very recently I was able to sort of condense it into what I'm now going to be calling the 5 layers of information. These 5 layers of information are things that we can extract from an image, from a concept, from a reference, from pictures, photographs, whatever. It's information that we can extract that we don't normally see. Like right now you're seeing Echo. You're seeing this picture. It's a very, very cool concept. I think this is from the League of Legends Project L game. But there's information here. There are things, there are 5 layers of information, plus 2 little extra ones that I'm going to give you at the very end, that can make you understand this piece even more. So that when you start doing it in 3D, for whatever it is, it could be 3D printing, games, cinematics. Once you translate this into a 3D piece, you use those layers of information to get an amazing result. So, if you want to learn this, well, you're in the right place. Let's go. Now we're going to jump into actually understanding and analyzing these layers that we have on our character. Remember, I like to say that there is 5 layers of information that you can extract from the element, and these layers of information are references for you. These are things that you're going to use as tools. They're not necessarily going to be visible on your final sculpt, but they're going to be there so that you can guide yourself and make sure that you match the concept or match the reference or do anything that you're doing as precise as possible. And the first one, of course, the most obvious one, and the one that every single teacher out there should be repeating is, of course, silhouette. So when you're designing a character, one of the things that they always tell you is that the silhouette of the character should be interesting. You don't want to have just like a Slender Man that's like completely flat and just like a humanoid. Well, actually, Slender Man has an interesting silhouette because he's very tall. But you don't want to have like a very boring silhouette. You're always going to go for a silhouette that allows you to portray specific characteristics of your character so that when you turn off everything, that there's no light information, there's no, I don't know, illumination, the character is very far away from the screen, the character is in the middle of a fight and stuff like that, you always want to be able to identify where he is, who he is, and what's going on, right? And this is something that we see all the time in stylized games, but you can use this even like in realistic games. Fighting games use this all the time. That's why every single character in a fighting game usually has a very like particular silhouette. It could be a hairstyle, it could be a piece of armor, it could be something, so that when you you're just watching and sort of in the middle of the action, you don't feel lost. You understand what's going on and who is who and what they're doing. So this silhouette right here, for instance, I'm pretty sure I can show this to anyone who's familiar, of course, with the League of Legends universe, and they'll be able to say, oh yeah, that's Echo. How do we know that? Well, we got a couple of very important characteristics. We got the hairstyle, we got the scarf right here, and we got a relatively slim body build as well. So those things are what makes Echo Echo. So if you are doing an Echo fan art, or if you're doing an Echo sculpt, you need to make sure to capture those silhouettes. Otherwise, it's not gonna look like Echo. And this is something that I see all the time when I'm reviewing portfolios, where people are copying a concept and they don't really look at the silhouette. They don't look at it. They're not analyzing it. And it's difficult for me to tell them that they're doing a good job because you don't even understand what you're looking at, okay? So being able to visualize the silhouette is very important. If you need to go into a software like Krita or Photoshop and do this exercise where you actually draw the silhouette, that's super important, because this is going to allow us to add a couple more layers. So again, first layer of information that you need to extract from your object is the silhouette. And this comes from a very sort of interesting evolutionary thing that we have as humans, where our brains and our eyes have been evolving through centuries to extract information from what we see. So very primitive creatures back in millennia ago, they only were able to differentiate between what was light and what was dark. As we developed the eye and the lens and all of the stuff, we were able to capture more and more information. But in a fundamental level, the thing that we see with silhouettes, it's how how interesting or how different the elements are. This is how, again, back in the day, little animals were able to run from a predator, because they would see a silhouette approaching and there's like, oh, that's dangerous. It's a very big silhouette, or it's a very spiky silhouette, like a dinosaur or something like that. Let's run. So that's what we need to focus when we're doing characters. I'm not going to go into design itself, because this lecture is more about how to use the information within an image to get better at modeling and sculpting. But you do need to understand that there are, as you see right here, bad silhouettes, better silhouettes, and really good silhouettes that are very identifiable. Usually if you're doing a human character, you always want to add something. Otherwise, it just looks like generic knight number 3, generic princess number 57. So all those kind of elements, it's important to go and try to find a more interesting silhouette. So next time you see a character, look at the silhouette. That one, again, is going to be the first step on this whole journey. The second element plays nicely with this thing right here, and these are what I call the negative shapes. Well, it's not that I call them, of course. I didn't discover them. I've been gathering this information for a long time. So I got the comment the other day that was like, oh, you're just stealing information. No, that's how we learn. You learn information and then you give it your own spin, your own twist. So this is the negative shapes, okay? And negative shapes are really good. We use them especially in gesture drawing when you're trying to draw a figure, like a male or female figure, in a very short amount of time. So you're not gonna have the time to capture all of the muscle details and all of the skin folds and things like that. So you need to focus on the gesture, which is the movement of the figure, and you need to focus on the negative shapes. So how do you find this? You're gonna go to 2 limits of your object, 2 points that are on the outside of the silhouette, and then you're just gonna fill that in with a line. And that right there is a negative silhouette. Okay, so we go from here to here. Actually, let me get in that in a different layer, because I wanna do a little collage at the very end. So there we go. So we go to 1 point, another point, we close that, and that shape right there is a lot easier for me to draw. I can very, very easily visualize that shape and draw it. And I'm gonna know that if I draw that shape correctly, I'm matching where the ear is eventually going to be, where the face is eventually going to be, where the scarf is eventually going to be. So sometimes it's a lot easier to block in this shape right here to make sure that my proportions on the negative shapes are like well done before we start doing all of the detail. These are also a very good way to, again, measure and evaluate whether or not you are doing a good job. Because if you see your concept, if you see your reference, and then you see your sculpture, your model, and the negative shapes don't match, like imagine my negative shape right here was something like this, right? Like that's wrong. That's not working. That means I'm making things too long. I'm not making them wide enough. And this is a very good way, again, to visualize the proportions and the elements of our character. So again, you find a high point on both sides of the silhouette, you close that, and you create the negative shape right there. So again, it's going to be a little bit easier to make sure that you match that negative shape instead of focusing on all of these things. This is a process that I always do on the primary blocking stages, so when I'm doing like the basic proportions and things like that, but I always go back to this at the very end when I'm just adjusting like the little things here and there for your character, because it can be lost or get lost as you add more and more detail. But it's very, very important that you don't forget that these negative shapes are a very good way to tell whether or not you are matching the concept or not. And look at that. By adding just that little thing right there, we're separating, right, the character from the background, and it's a lot easier to tell what's going on. So that's the second level of information that we need to extract from every reference that we see. And these 2 elements, I call them the 2D level, okay? So on a 2D level, on a flat level of information, this is what we need to extract from every single thing. And this works for weapons, this works for environments, this works for characters, this works for absolutely everything, understanding the silhouette of the objects and the negative spaces within the shapes of that object. Now we're gonna go to the 3D stage. So in the 3D stage, the first thing that we're gonna go for is what I call the main shapes or the primary forms. If you've taken any of my courses, I mentioned this quite a bit whenever we're doing anything. So primary 3D forms are things like cubes, right? There are things like cylinders, there are things like toruses, like any shape that's just a basic primitive, that's the primary form of the 3D shapes. And when I'm looking at a character right here, let me add another layer here. What we need to look for is those primary shapes. And now we need to start thinking about the 3D world, the perspective and things like that. So for instance, here on the arm, I can see and be like, okay, where the deltoid finishes or stops, I'm gonna have pretty much like a cylinder that tapers down a little bit towards the elbow. So that's going to be my 3D shape right there. And the deltoid, we can think of it like a sphere. So we're going to add a little bit of a form right there. There we go. Same for the head. The head is usually used like a sphere, right? And we use like a little bit of a wedge on the front. Each of these guys right here is a cylinder, right? So each of this, like, what they call these things in English? In Spanish, we call them rastas, but I always forget what they're called in English. But all of these are pretty much cylinders, so every single one of them is a cylinder. If we go to the torso, of course, here's where a little bit of knowledge of anatomy is really good, because we know that that's where the ribcage border is, and we can find the sort of like circular or cylindrical shape that's going to give us the main forms. Again, I'm not worrying about muscles or anything. I'm just worrying about main forms of the object. Think about doing just like a very basic like a C-sphere mesh or C-sphere character. That's what we're looking for in here. And again, it's important for me to do this sort of like analysis, whether while I'm working on the character itself or if I have a question about any specific proportion, because this thing will make sure that my character is following the proper proportions and the proper forms. Again, look at that. So we don't need the image anymore. We can already see where the main volumes, where the main primary forms of the character are going to be. And this is, again, a very important part. In certain, again, classes that I teach, I try to use a very constructive method like this, where we go into Maya or Blender and we use primitives to build the basic shape of the character. Then we jump into ZBrush and start sculpting. I normally don't do that while I'm working on something for production, because that's just an extra step. But when you're first learning, this is a very, very good way to make sure that you understand where all of these elements are. Okay, so that's layer number 3. Layer number 4. Let's grab a different color here. Let's go for like a pink. Layer number 4 is very interesting, because layer number 4 talks about light and shadow. Okay? Light and shadow. In light and shadow, I'm going to turn this off for just a second. Oh, actually, let's delete that real quick. There we go. Let's add another layer. And light and shadow is how we're going to be looking at the secondary planes of the object, because we already have the primary planes thanks to these primary forms. But if we want to go to the next level of our analysis, we need to understand that every single object, for instance, the scarf right here, will have parts that are going to be hitting the light, right? So even though the scarf can be simplified into a cylinder on its primary forms, because it definitely looks like a couple of cylinders, there will be one part that's going to be shadow, and there's going to be one part that's going to be light. So what does that tell me? Well, it tells me that the form is actually in different angles. One angle is facing the light and the other angle is facing the shadow. And again, that allows me to understand how I should push things, because all of this information, especially the 3D layers information, so the primary forms and this light and shadows, they live within the silhouette. And very commonly in 2D art, like, you cannot rotate the 2D art, right? So you need to learn how to visualize these elements, how to visualize this specific like light effects, and realize that, hey, I need to create some planes here. We're going to talk about a bonus layer, the bonus layer at the very end, where I'm going to explain a little bit of this. But you need to understand that there will be layers, again, that are going to be your shadow, right? Like your dark layer. And then there's going to be layers that are going to be your light layers right here. And that differentiation, that like a split that you're going to find in elements, will again allow you to visualize how the forms change as they go around the previous element that we had right here. So this is where I understand, like, oh, okay, yeah, we do have a cylinder here on the arm, but it's not a perfect cylinder. I know this is cell shaded, but in this particular case, what's going to happen is the cylinder is going to have a little bit of a plane change right here, which is where the bicep is, right? This whole muscle right here, that's the bicep. So the bicep, this shadow is telling me that the bicep has two faces, one facing the light and one facing the shadow. Therefore, if I was doing like a cross section, that would tell me that the bicep has an angle, and this gives me more form. So we go from primary form to secondary form, where we start carving and understanding how each of the muscles change. Same for the deltoid right here. Like, I see this light shadow right there. What does that tell me? Well, it tells me that there's going to be a flat plane right here, and then another flat plane right here where the shadow lies. Now, based on experience, and this is layer number 5, the final layer, let's add another one right here. Based on experience, I know that not everything's going to be completely flat. And this is where we add form, okay? This is what I like to call the form layer. So once I understand that there's going to be two planes right here, the next thing where you need to sort of like, again, look at reference, look at other parts of the body, like I can see this is round. So I know that this is not going to be going straight and then straight like that. There are certain games that are very, very stylized where you see like a very intense plane, but not in this particular case. So yes, we're going to have a division thanks to this shadow right here. So this is one side and this is another side, but there's actually going to be a roundness to it, right? There's going to be some roundness to it, and the object will curve out and generate the volume that we're looking for. So that's what you're looking at. As an artist, as a character artist, as a 3D modeler or whatever, this is what you're looking for. You're looking for that very easy to find, easy to understand form that, again, later on, we can like add a little bit of shadow here, right? And that is a 3D shape that we're looking at. So you can imagine this is kind of like building the topology, right, of the objects. Not exactly topology, this is just the form. If you've ever seen like the Anatomy for Sculptures book, they use this method all the time, where they just create the, they draw on top of the muscles and of the forms so that you can understand how they flow. So all of these things, like all of these layers that I'm showing you right now, as you can see, they're a mix of all of these different elements of information that you can gather from your character. And again, we don't even need the character anymore. You see this and you can already see, like, it's kind of like I'm sculpting the character with just like basic 2D sketches. This is the information that you need to learn to process in your brain, in your head, while you're sculpting. So you have your reference, you have your sculpt, you're sculpting in ZBrush, you look to the side, and all of this, you go through your checklist. How's my silhouette? How's my negative forms? How are my primary forms? How is my light and the shadow? How is my main forms or my 3D forms? Like all of those things you like consciously or unconsciously go through them to make sure that you're matching whatever it is you're modeling. Because very, very often I see people just like, okay, yeah, it looks good, I'm gonna leave it there. It's like, no, dude, you really need to go the extra mile and make sure that you're hitting all of these points right here. So that's it. These are the 5 main layers of information that I always like to analyze on my elements, and especially on tricky subjects. This is a relatively simple character because it's a humanoid. It has a lot of props, but it's a relatively simple character. But you will encounter like very, very complex characters. So for instance, like if I look for character concept art, there will be some of them that are a little bit more tricky, because there's a lot of stuff going on, like this one right here I've mentioned in another like moment. Like, oh damn, like that robot's very cool. It's a very, very cool concept. I love it, but it's very complex. So I would definitely spend at least an hour maybe going through this section right here, or this exercise right here, to make sure I understand what the main silhouette is, what the main forms are, what are the proportions of the elements. Now, those again are the 5 main things, but I want to show you a couple more elements that it's very, very important that you find. I'm not including them over on this list because I feel like they kind of like break the niceness of talking about these 5 elements. By the way, this one, we're going to call it 3D form. So it's silhouette, negative shapes, primary forms, light shadows, and 3D forms. And those are the things that you're looking for on the... Actually, let's, again, to simplify and have things be a little bit more clear, let's call this primary volumes instead. There we go. That looks better. So silhouette, negative shapes, primary volumes, light and shadows, light and shadow, and 3D forms. Those are the elements that you are always looking for. Now, the extra elements, and I mentioned on the intro that there was a couple of extra little secrets right there. The extra elements that we're going to look for are, first of all, proportions. Oh my God, how do I explain this to you, my friends? This is one of the things that everyone messes up, and I even messed this up, by the way. This is a very, very common mistake that we make as artists. And proportions are the relationships between different parts of your character. And you need to learn how to measure your proportions, guys. People very, very frequently, again, in portfolio review, they mess up the proportions. They'll see a concept piece, like a gun or something, and they'll make it longer, or they'll make it like super short. It's like, dude, this is your proportion. That's your line. That's your measurement. Why are you going longer? Why are you going shorter? Look at your reference. There's a method that I like to use for proportions, especially for characters. This one was taught to me by an amazing, excellent teacher. His name is Ray Bustos. He's an anatomy teacher. And he calls this the constellation approach, where you pinpoint the articulations of your character, right? Like here on the arm. You pinpoint the articulations, and then you just draw a line. And that's it. In my reference, this is how long the distance from the shoulder to the elbow is, and the distance from the elbow to the wrist is. right? And I can then go, okay, from the clavicle to the shoulder, that's going to be the distance. From the clavicle to the end of the ribcage border, that's going to be the distance. From the pelvis to the knee, that's going to be the distance right there, roughly. Probably going to be a little bit higher. So right around there. So you draw these lines, you draw these proportions, and then you follow them. You follow them, guys. Like, you make sure that this distance right here is the exact same distance that I have in my 3D model. I make sure that this distance right here is the exact same distance I have in my sculpt. Because if you don't, if you just do this like constellation approach and then you don't check that the proportions are right, you're gonna have a very, very bad time. Another technique that you can use for proportions is start comparing elements to other elements. So for instance, I can compare the size of the ear right here, right? That's a proportion compared to the size of the nose. And what do I notice? They're very similar. This one, if this one's a 1, this one's probably like a 1.2. So his nose is a little bit bigger than his ears, or his ears a little bit smaller than his nose. If I check my sculpt and I see that the ears are way bigger than the nose, I'm in the wrong. I need to fix that proportion. I need to check that. Same thing for, again, like the chest. Like, what's the distance here that we have in the chest compared to the distance that we have here on the waist, compared to the distance that we have here on the hips, right? Those are all proportions. Those are all elements that you constantly need to be checking on your reference, on your pictures, or your whatever it is you're doing, so that you get a proper result on the final element. There will be certain like things that you might need to change, and this is something that I mention very, very frequently. When you're doing a translation from a 2D concept to a 3D concept or 3D model, you're winning an extra, or you're gaining an extra dimension, right? So things might not be perfectly exact to the 2D stuff. There might be things, for instance, like I immediately see a couple of these things like interlocking between each other. That's the kind of stuff that I would ask the art directors, like, hey, can we do a little bit of a modification there? Because that's going to be tricky to model, tricky to rig, tricky to animate. We might want to have it a little bit cleaner. And that's the kind of stuff that you're going to change as you go on. But a very good rule of thumb is to try to make sure that all of your proportions are as close as possible, okay? So make sure you follow these proportions right here. And finally, let's call this the seventh, the final little like information here. Let's go for like a lime green. Is topology, of course. This is only specific for those that are doing 3D for things like animation or deformation and things like that. But you do need to think about topology. And very often, again, you will find complicated objects like this scarf right here. And it might be a little bit tricky to visualize how you're going to be doing this. So a very cool exercise I like to do is I'll go in here. Of course, I'm going to capture the silhouette because I know that I need that silhouette. And I'm going to start thinking about, okay, how am I going to like retopologize this, or how am I going to model this? And I look for, again, the lights and the shadows. It's the first like section. I look for like deep lines or deep groups like that one right there. And then I start following basic like retopology processes, like the ones we talked about in the retopology course, which is, okay, we're probably going to have like a center line. There we go. If I see a border, there's probably going to be like a support edge right there. So this one tells me that, hey, we're falling this way. Like I see this like white line, that's probably going to be retopologized as well to have a little bit more depth. And it's just, it might not be the final retopology that I'm going to be using. We might change this later on. We make sure that the squares are as evenly distributed as we can. Remember that one rule for retopology is that everything should be going up and down and left and right, again, most of the times. So this is a very, very fast and easy way to think about how you're going to be handling topology before you actually do the retopology. All of this can be done in sculpting first, right? Like you just do with Dynamesh and you don't worry about topology. But once you're preparing this for a game engine or something, you definitely need to see how you're going to be dealing with all of this like intricate plane changes and intricate elements that are going to give you the specific look that you're going for. So for instance, here I see there's a little bit of a break, so there might be a couple of triangles here and there. And again, this construction right here will make it a lot easier once you get into the retopology phase, because you don't need to think about the answer. If there's something that I want you guys to take from all of these things that we're talking right now, is that planning ahead, like understanding what you're doing before you start doing it, will be a really good way to set you on a path to success. Because one of the things that I see all the time, and I'm guilty of this, I've done this before, I do this sometimes still, is I'll see a concept and I'll just open Maya, I'll open ZBrush, and I'll just start working on it without taking the time to really analyze and understand what am I gonna be doing. And then what happens, you get stuck at one part, you don't understand what you're doing, things are not looking good, you get demotivated, you close, and it goes into the pile of work in progress things that you're never gonna finish. And we don't want that. We don't want to get to that point. We want to try and make sure that we can finish a project and finish it in the best possible way. So that's it. With this, we're pretty much done. Again, 7 little things that you can think about, and this is something that I love. Look at this. Like, we take out the picture, the reference image, and we can still see the character through all of this information, because again, this is kind of like hidden information that lives within the character and that we're going to be able to use to get as close as possible to the reference and get a nice model for a portfolio, for production, for whatever it is we're doing. If you like this type of content, guys, let me know. I normally don't do a lot of theory-heavy stuff because I know not everyone likes to watch like a, I don't know, like a 20-minute video of this kind of stuff, but it's very important. It's one of those things that if you do, as I mentioned in the intro video, if you learn this and you use it, your art will improve. You will have a better understanding of shapes, forms, silhouette, proportions, topology, all of these things, and your art will benefit from it. So, thank you. If you're watching this at the very end, let me know in the comments, because you are one of the artists that are really gonna go and create amazing things. All of those that stop watching at the 30-second mark, they might find this information somewhere else, of course, but well, you have it now, and you have the tools to create amazing things. And as we always say here on the channel, always learning, always improving. Thanks for your support, guys. I'll see you back on the next one.